Hey, what's going on? I wanted to make a quick video about how to use Unity's new input system. It's a preview package available in 2018-2019 Unity. A lot of tutorials on YouTube are kind of lackluster in my opinion. They tend to use practices that are hard to follow, things like send message, things like that. And I wanted to show you a bit of a better way to use it in your project. I'm not going to go super in depth into, how to write a full-on character controller using it, but I hope it gives you the foundation you need and doesn't leave you scratching your head. First thing we're going to need to do is open up our package manager, and of course I'm sure you're familiar with need to show the preview packages, as the input system is actually a preview package. It will take a minute because it is loading the packages, as you can see down here in the bottom right, bottom left actually. We're going to scroll down to input system here and click install. It'll take a second, and then it will prompt us to enable the new back-end layer for Unity's input bindings. Alright, so here's the prompt. The project is using the new input system package, which we did just install, but the native platform backends for the new input system are not enabled in the player settings. This will mean that no input will come from native devices. Do you want to enable the backends? We're going to click yes to that, which allows it to enable the native backends in our project. These backends are required for things like native gamepads, things like that, and that is obviously very useful to us. There is something we're going to do to our project anyway though. Let's go ahead and close out of this input system, and let's go over to edit and open project settings. I always like to snap it over to my inspector over here, like that, and I will just make this a little bit bigger for you to see. We're going to scroll down here, and you will see under other settings in the player settings, you may have to expand this out like so, that active input handling is set to both. Now these menus change all the time depending on the Unity version. Currently I'm using 2019.2.4. If you don't see this but you did click yes to the prompt, you should be fine. Don't worry about it too much, but otherwise click on input system. If you click both, that will allow the old input system to work. So if you're working on a project and you're slowly merging the two over, then go ahead and enable both. But if you're confident you're going to use the new input system, I would enable just one, so you don't have to worry about having any sort of bugs. I think it's best to eliminate as many potential issues as possible, and going all for one tends to be the way to go for me. So you can see after we've restarted Unity, our active input system is now just the input system preview. You can always change this, of course, throughout your project. Alrighty, so the next thing I've done is created a couple of folders in my assets here. I've created a presets folder and a scripts folder. We're going to start out with the presets folder and click create. And you'll notice down the bottom we have an input actions menu button. It's right at the very bottom, and it doesn't say input system anywhere, so it can be kind of hard to find. We're going to click that, and this will allow us to create a map of all of the controls for our game and what their names are, so that we can use them in our code. And we will write some code very, very shortly. We're going to name this player movement. This could be whatever you like: car movement, menu movement, whatever the heck you like. So this will bring up this dialog when we open it. It gives us a nice little thing. It might be maximized, it's kind of annoying, but it gives us a nice little way to map out our inputs. So let's start with action maps. We'll click the plus button, and the plus button will allow us to create a new action map with some actions bound. Now, what is an action map? An action map, as far as I understand it, is just a list of different actions that is organized into a sort of a category. So think of an action map like a category of actions, and think of an action as something that a button is bound to. For instance, you might have the category movement, which would be your action map. So we're going to type movement. Then you might have an action named jump. So let's right click this and click rename, and we'll type jump for our action. So our action is to jump, and that's a part of the map movement. Finally, we'll click the binding that's created here, and let's go ahead and listen and hit space, and you'll see the space button comes up on our keyboard. We can actually listen for the input. Just to show you that again, I'll hit L on my keyboard and it will come up. Another thing you can do is, of course, you can simply type in the name of the key, or you can navigate through the different menus here. Anyway, it's important to take note that the action type for this action is a button. We also have two others, value and pass-through. I'm not going to go in depth on all of these since it's fairly intuitive on its own, but I will show you one more type of binding that we can have. Okay, so to create the new binding, we're going to click the plus button here, and we're going to type in directional to be our directional movement. And instead of the binding here, let's go ahead and get rid of that. I'm going to show you a 2D vector composite. So I'm going to click on 2D vector composite, and we can leave this alone. It doesn't really need a name here. But what is important here is that we can now set a value of 4 different buttons. Now, this is quite neat. You may be wondering, a vector 2 is an xy coordinate. How does it fit 4 in there? Well, it's pretty simple. It's positive and negative on the x and positive and negative on the y-axis. So this would be our typical WASD key. So we'll do W and S for up and down. That's on our y-axis. And then we'll do A and D on our x-axis. Great. So how do we actually get around to using these vectors and these button values in our code? Well, I'll show you. First, we're going to click Save, and you'll see the little star goes away. And we're going to click on the inspector with our player movement preset selected. It does tend to shit out some console errors. It is a preview package, so that's fine. Next thing we're going to do is click Generate C# class. And this will generate a class with all of our bindings mapped to appropriate objects, including interfaces for us to actually bind our own functions to those events, if you will. So we're going to call this class file. Let's just click on, let's just click here and we'll go into Assets, Scripts, and I'm going to call this playercontrol.cs. I'm going to name the file player control, the class name player control, and I'm going to put this in the namespace tutorial. And when we click apply and we go into our scripts, you will actually see a player control script has been generated with a ton of really weird looking information, including a bunch of unique IDs here. Now we're going to use that in our player movement script. Before I get started with that script, let's actually create something to use it. So we'll start with a plane, and I'm just going to move it like this. Then we'll create a capsule for our player. We'll move him onto here. We'll give him a rigid body as you normally would. And finally, we will write a script here for him called player movement. It can be called whatever you like, of course. Let's go ahead and drag the script onto our player by selecting him and dragging the script on. And we will make sure to rename him to player. Alrighty, so now we are in the player movement script that we've created for our rigid body, and you can see that I've encapsulated it inside the namespace tutorial, which is the same namespace that our player control script was in. It's important to take note that, of course, the namespace matters here just like any other code. In order to start using our player control script, we're going to want to instantiate it just like a normal object in C#. So let's create a reference to player control here. Name that with a lowercase p. And inside our awake method, we're going to set that to new player control. It doesn't take any arguments. Now, in order to tell player control that this class is going to provide the callbacks or provide some callbacks for the movement actions that we created in that little GUI, we're going to want to implement one of the interfaces that it provides. So let's put a comma here to specify we're going to implement an interface. And we will type playercontrol.iMovementActions. And you'll see iMovementActions is actually generated by, if I open up my presets, movement. So if this was called Bob, it would be called iBobActions. Pretty useful. Let's open back up our code. And you can see that it's telling us we want to implement 2 interface members. These are methods that are provided by our movement actions script, onJump and onDirectional. You will recognize that we actually created those. So let's specify them. They'll need to be public methods. They do not have a return type, so they're void, and they are named on and then the action name and accept an input action.callback context. In order to get the input action type, you'll need to use the InputSystem namespace or specify InputSystem beforehand. So we'll see input action, callback context, and I'm going to name the parameter CTX. Let's also, in order to satisfy the interface here, specify onDirectional. And there we go. Our error is now gone. We implement these methods. We'll just debug.log, jump, and debug.log, movement. And finally, we want to tell the player control to actually bind this instance of player movement that we're currently in to the callbacks that it provides for these pieces of code. So let's go ahead and write in player control. And we're going to specify the movement actions movement property or field. And we'll notice a few methods here, including enable, disable, and set callbacks. we're going to click set callbacks, and we're going to set it to the instance of this class, which of course is just the this keyword. You may have noticed the enable and disable, they sound kind of important. We will actually need to enable and disable. And the best way to do this is using the onEnable and onDisable methods in our script. So let's try it. Player control dot movement dot set callbacks, or sorry, dot set callbacks. What am I doing? Dot enable. There we go. Kind of on autopilot there for a second. Move this back, and when our script disables, you guessed it, we're going to call disable. So this will be fairly responsive. It means that if at any point we take our player out of the game or out of the scene by disabling it, we will simply disable the controls as well, so we won't be responding to movement on a, say, dead character. We're going to open up the game now, and we're going to click play. And if I press some keys, WASD, you will see movement is outputted. And if I press space, you will see jump is actually outputted 3 times. Now, we can actually read those values from the code. All right, so let's get started reading those values from the code. Instead of debug.log jump, we're going to actually check if ctx performed is true. Now, performed tells us whether the action was performed or not, and what that really maps to in a key press is whether the key is down or up. It was depressed or released. And if I go ahead and start up Unity again and click play, you'll notice instead of 3 jump calls, it will only print out jump once per space button press. Great, so now you know how to make your character jump. You simply add your code to make your character jump, like an add force call or a translate position call into this particular function, or of course you could store the value inside a field and then respond to it on a fixed update or on an update. How you do that is completely up to you, but now you know how to get that jump input. The next thing we're going to do is read the vector2 for our directional movement. Remember, we specified it's a composite vector2. So let's go ahead and call this cool little method to tell us exactly what kind of type we're getting. We're going to debug.log ctx.readValue as object. Now, readValue as object will spit out an object that tells us the value of the movement. So you'll see if I hold the D key, or sorry, hold the A key, we get -1 on the x-axis. Let go, we get 0. D key, +1 on the x-axis. Let go is 0. W, we get +1 on the y-axis. Let go, we get 0. And S, you guessed it, -1 on the y-axis. On the y-axis, that's the one. So this is super useful, but of course we want this as an actual variable. So now that we know that it's a vector2, we can simply type vector2 movement is equal to ctx.readValue, and we're going to pass in the type here. So we're going to tell it to read the value into a vector2. And let's go ahead and open up our script again, or open up our game again. I will replay the game. And you see the same movement will come out after I actually remember to log it out onto the console. Very good. Now you may notice the 0.7 here. So the 0.7 is actually because it's combining the 2 input vectors. Pretty useful if you want to limit directional movement, etc. There are a plethora, that's the word, of options under the player movement preset. If you ever make a change, all you need to do, let's say we add in another action, all you need to do is click the Save Asset button up here. So let's add in crouch, just as an example. Let's bind it to the C key on our keyboard, and let's click Save Asset, and that will regenerate our player movement, or our player control script. You will now see we get an error. What is that error? You guessed it. Player movement does not implement interface player control. I have movement actions on crouch. So we now need to actually add in public void on crouch, input action.callbackContext ctx, debug.log ctx.readValue as object. And now we should get a nice little piece of code telling us when we've crouched. So you can see 1 and 0. That represents whether or not we have crouched. So I hope this helped you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. I hope it helped you go from a point of not understanding the input system at all to knowing where to go from here, since a lot of the videos online can be quite confusing. Thanks for watching.